The union of opposites is an attempt to merge ideas that are generally perceived as incompatible. Ultimately, our goal is to demonstrate the integration of differences towards a new transcendent other, rather than simply seeking a neutral middle ground between them. Alchemically, this is known as the royal marriage, or the great work, in which the philosopher's stone, a divine tool symbolizing the attainment of truth and self-realization, is forged. We believe that polarities can be reconciled, as true growth and evolution will only occur by integration with, and not by the destruction of, opposition.
Define free speech. The right to express any opinions without censorship or restraint.
Yeah, so I definitely think in the modern context, free speech is certainly a right, although I wonder sometimes how many lapses in history there have been where it was just something that was naturally bestowed upon man, where you could just say whatever you wanted in your little tribe or whatever. But yes, it's a right, and it's basically the idea that no matter how outrageous or flat out wrong your opinion is, you're protected from persecution. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I want to say about free speech is there's a lot of, I guess, debate on whether or not it's a right, like what natural rights are. It's kind of a different conversation. I don't really have much to add by the way of the definition. It's just that little nuance that I want to add in for future reference.
Definitely.
Define cancel culture. The practice of withdrawing support for or canceling public figures and companies after they have done or said something considered objectionable or offensive.
So these definitions are actually pretty self-explanatory. I don't really have much else to add by the way of definition, but do you have a couple of examples of cancel culture that you want to shout out?
Yeah, I think the two most extreme examples of cancel culture being brought to its apex are, of course, Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos, who were literally removed from all social media platforms, who have different CEOs with different ideas and different life experiences, but for whatever reason, they all cooperated together to remove them from all of their platforms. And I think that's probably the most relevant example.
Just because of the things that they're saying?
Yeah, just because, like Milo Yiannopoulos, he's kind of like the right-wing Jon Stewart, and it's kind of hard to put people like that in a box. So it's like, oh, we don't know what to do with them, so just put them on the shelf,
Sure. And then there was, like, in my opinion or examples, Jesse Smollett was, if anybody out there doesn't know who that is, he's an actor who did some crazy stuff and tried to start what seems to be a race war, and he was kind of canceled, which was crazy, just how much hate he got.
Right.
And another example would probably be, who's the creator of Rick and Morty?
Dan Harmon.
Dan Harmon, yeah. So Dan Harmon did some pretty obscene stuff in his past that came to light that was over a decade ago, I think, maybe more, in which he did some pretty obscene acts on camera and kind of got canceled for it. So these are a few examples of people whose actual television series or roles as an actor or actual platform in their podcast or whatever are actually being dismantled and canceled by the public for things that they've said or done. So a couple examples
right
there.
And if I was going to try to define cancel culture in a good light, which I think to a certain degree you can, is I would say that it's the idea that you should be held responsible for what you say. And I fundamentally agree with that idea. I just think what it's devolved into is this idea that you can be banished for something you did or said maybe even 20 years ago, and maybe it doesn't align with who you are now, and that I don't agree with.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, cool. I can see where you're coming from there.
Yeah.
So let's jump in.
Okay.
Is freedom of expression important? Is there any actual utility in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely think that there's utility in being able to speak freely and speak clearly, although that's the caveat that I would add, is that it comes with great responsibility. You should be weary of what you say and in what context you say it. But for me, it just comes down to the idea that if I have a bad idea that I picked up somewhere along my childhood, and I don't live in a society that fosters my ability to speak my mind, well, then I'll never speak or utter that idea to somebody who might be able to tell me why it's wrong.
Right.
And so therefore I'm less likely to grow as a person.
Exactly. And so that's one point that I really am adamant about as well. I do believe that freedom of speech has utility and is quite important.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the time there's this social stipulation where people think that freedom of speech is some frivolous right that we have.
Yeah, frolicky thing.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, freedom of speech. They've heard it so many times. Nobody really takes it seriously or understands the value.
It's like a mantra.
Yeah, so or it's almost like a meme that everyone laughs at, or something that's taken for granted, I think. Where a lot of people don't understand the utility of it. It seems to me like people just look at it in that light. Like, oh, why are you harping about freedom of speech constantly every single day? Like, give it a rest already, you know what I mean?
Right.
But it's more than that. It's more than just something that our forefathers were adamant about. It's more than just things that we fought and died for in the past. It is truly a social utility. It's like a tool in which when we speak to each other with free speech, the language that we use, unadulterated and uncontrolled. There's no constraints over what we can and can't say. Exactly what you said. When we say something that we really believe in that's absolute trash, society can work out of its own devices what is and what isn't acceptable.
Right.
And it's not necessarily legislated. Because you get into some hairy scenarios where you start legislating what people can and can't say, and you go down this weird slippery slope towards authoritarian regimes telling you what you can and can't do.
Right.
Because ideas start in your head, and then you speak about your ideas, and then those ideas take place in action, and then it becomes part of reality around you. And if you limit those thoughts and limit your speech, which will then limit thought, transference of thought, then you're hard limiting and actually crippling the potential outcome for change or evolution in your social construct.
Right. And that's what I was going to say too, is I think being able to speak freely is a form of thinking, but it's not the same as thinking inside of your head. So like to use an example that's relevant to us, sometimes when I do these podcasts with you, I say something that I've never thought of before, and it's because we're working it out together. And when you have the ability to do that, new things are downloaded and new things gears start to turn up there that you'd never turned before.
Right. And we've talked about this in other episodes, but you have bits of knowledge that are residing inside of your mental space that maybe you've subconsciously thought about before, or they're just data fragments, things that you've come across in your day-to-day life, and you're not necessarily consciously frontal lobe thinking about these things, frontal cortex. They're just like pieces of information that are hiding within you. And as you're speaking in a conversation with someone, you're putting things together that you may not have done consciously before. And then all of a sudden there's this new novel thought that isn't necessarily novel to the whole world, but it's novel to you. And sometimes you're like, oh, where did that thought come from? I just had this amazing idea. It's almost like knowledge that you always had that you didn't know you had. Because you're making these connections and links in the lower order of your mental faculty. And if we have a fear of saying something that will get us in trouble, we are going to be suppressing that process. Unconsciously suppressing it.
Exactly.
Because we don't want to speak the wrong thing on accident and say something that's going to get us ridiculed or even hurt or killed, depending on where you live in the world and state of your social order. And so freedom of speech gives us that freedom to say whatever, such that new novel ideas can be brought forth into fruition.
And I think that's why the classroom was once predicated on speech. It wasn't so much like it is now, where they give you a book or a packet and they test you on it later. It was literally based on just people talking, because they understood the magic of speech and how it could invoke that new thought that you never had, that just totally came organically and wouldn't have come had you not sat down and tried to talk to somebody.
Like the Socratic seminar. That's where that came from. You go to any college out there, and even community colleges, and you'll sit in a circle with a bunch of people, and there'll be a topic that comes up, and you just sort of have a critical discussion about it in a group. And it's sort of like free flow, can say anything, and whatever ideas pop up, they kind of get analyzed, and then everyone's sort of moving forward together. It's kind of like the Paideia principle also. We'll talk more about those in other videos, but and episodes for the audio only listeners. But yeah, man, a good example of this is like saying the N-word. There's no legislation that says a white person cannot say the N-word. But there's this social order in which if a white person were to say the N-word, unless they got their N card from like their best friends and they've been accepted in that social group for whatever reason, they literally cannot do that. It's a limitation placed upon them through the social contract. Over the course of time, over the course of people in the free society determining what can and can't be said. There's also a sort of social contract in which you can't just yell profanities while you're at work. maybe there is, like in your employee handbook or
Right.
something that says, oh, like you will fire you because it's against our company policy for you to scream
Sure.
profanities. But for the most part, it's still not legislated. It's still not like controlled by law.
Mm-hmm.
And so to some degree, that's within the freedom of that private organization to tell you what you can and can't say.
Right.
But it's still their freedom to do that. And
Right. Would you say that it, like the proverbial line there would be, yes, sometimes there are situations where there's things you can't say, but as far as free speech goes, you could never force someone what to utter. Like you can't force them what to say, but you
Right.
can tell them what not to say.
right.
Yeah.
Right. To some level, that's the way that the social contract has evolved.
Right.
And when someone says freedom of speech, that's kind of what it means.
Gotcha.
It's the freedom to say whatever you want. And then the social order itself will organically place limitations upon you through the course of time and everyone's collective experience.
Is cancel culture important? Does cancel culture have utility?
No. Podcast over.
Hold on.
I'm joking.
This is a union of opposites.
Okay.
Funny, man. Okay, no. So is there utility in cancel culture? Yes. So there's a few things here. Just as you mentioned in the previous question, using free speech, as an application of using free speech, we can use that to try to speak out against other people and to try to get other people canceled, right? So there is some utility in actually trying to cancel someone through the use of your free speech, because you're participating in that greater conversation in which you are trying to do better for your society, and you see something that doesn't jive with your personal opinion about the world, and it doesn't mix with your worldview, and you would like your society to be better because you care about people and you care about yourself and you care about your family and your loved ones, and so you're trying to protect people ultimately, right? And I think that there's a level of love and compassion that come with, or that underlie the actual action of trying to cancel someone. And that is really essentially the utility of cancel culture, that it's a protective device, right? Where we're just trying to stop.
But certainly you're not saying that it always comes from a good place. You're just saying that it can come from.
It can,
right.
Yeah. And so that's the utility of it. It is that it is a function in which we can try to stop certain pieces of information from flowing freely in the world to protect ourselves and our loved ones, or to just and even in a negative way, I suppose, to subvert the truth because you want to paint a certain narrative, whether or not it's morally just or you're correct in making that action. The utility of cancel culture is such that you are stopping something from happening in the world that you don't want to happen.
Right. Or condemning it because
you just don't want to see it.
Right.
Like with the example of Alex Jones sometimes does spew a lot of bullshit, but sometimes he's also speaking the truth. Like 20 years ago, he was talking about Epstein Island, before this whole 2019 shebang, right? And he also talks about like interdimensional DMT aliens and vampires and all these crazy things that some people may or may not buy into. And so they're like, oh, that guy's a nut job. I don't want my children coming across his videos on YouTube because they're just going to pollute their minds.
Right.
And so we're going to kill him metaphorically. They're going to like do like everybody did Socrates in the Apology.
Yeah, but and at a certain level, that's not a bad thing to want to do. Like if you even more so than it being an extension of your free speech, it's also just practicing your freedom in general. If I go to a dinner party and I make a joke that's degrading to women or something like that, and that family just didn't think it was funny or didn't jive with it, they can choose to never have me over again. And that's kind of what it is, right? But at the same time, by doing that, by condemning someone's free speech or their actions, you're kind of treating yourself like a reverse prisoner. Whereas instead of the world needs to be protected from you, it's like you need to be protected from exposure of someone else's ideas. And I don't think that's necessarily a great position to take.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's like on the flip side of the coin, right?
Exactly. We're supposed to be talking about utility, but yeah.
There is utility in that, though. It's just the flip side, right? It's just whatever your motivation is, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Whatever the motivation is doesn't matter.
Right.
Whether it's good or bad, or for the greater good or for your own personal gain. It's just the act of canceling someone to the degree that they can no longer make money on a platform, or that they can no longer get their voice heard by the public, or that they're totally removed and banned from the internet or from some forum or something to where they just can't come and get their voice heard. And to where you are limiting their free speech for whatever purpose, that's the utility.
Right, but sometimes it has the opposite effect. When someone is silenced, it starts to get people's mind going, like, why is that person silenced? So it's not always
right. So I mean, that's
efficacious.
sort of that's going in a different direction of whether or not it's efficacious, like you said, but it's still the utility.
Whether or not it has utility. Yeah. So, but I guess that brings us to what degree someone can be canceled.
Sure. Yeah.
To what extent can someone actually be canceled in this modern day and age?
So I kind of think that the degree to which someone can be canceled is not something we've seen run its course yet. I think it has the potentiality to get there. I just don't think we've crossed those lines quite at this point. But even with like a guy like Alex Jones, who's been removed from all social media platforms, he still has his domain and he still has his website where he's generating millions of dollars. So it's not like we've banished him to the point where he has to go wander off into the woods live, as a hermit. He's still propagating in the world, even though we've kind of said no to him,
I mean, so he's not going to go like Henry David Thoreau status, right?
Right.
Or like Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah, that's a better example.
Yeah, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yeah. He basically, like, that's a good question to ask, and that's a good answer. We haven't reached the plateau. We haven't hit like rock bottom yet.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Sure. So, but you're saying there will be a time, if we're not careful, there is a slippery slope in which we will eventually get to the point where you can be totally silenced.
Especially as technology becomes, more and more innovative. I think that's where we run the risk.
So I think to answer the question on my end, it really, there's two factors or three factors at play. One is your actual government and the governmental power.
Right. Because we didn't even talk about social credit scores in China. Yeah.
Soviet Union or Maoist China, like actual totalitarian regimes. Shout out to the 1984 book review.
Right. That might be rock bottom.
Yeah, that's true rock bottom, in which like nothing that you do can feel like it can stop it.
Right.
If you say the wrong thing, your family can be killed. And
right.
Multiple generations and your cousins' children can be killed.
Yep. Shout out to our book review on 1984.
Yeah, check it out.
Yep.
The link will be in the description, and there should be a card popping up here above us if you're on YouTube. So that's the first thing: government and governmental power over the cancel culture happening.
Right. Right now, it just seems to be societal,
right? So
media driven.
In where we're at in the West, the two big factors are tech media companies and how much influence they actually have on our lives,
right?
And how much influence we allow them to have on our lives. And then the second thing is how much weight we give to unpopular opinions in our society,
right?
So tech media and their powers, and then how much we actually care about unpopular opinions. Because right now we exist in a social order in which it seems like we give a lot of power to minority groups. There's just these weird postmodern power struggles constantly.
Right.
And if you're a social minority group, then you get a larger slice of the pie, or your
stock is bigger.
Right. Your stock is a little bit bigger. You're given more grace and more, I guess, you're given like a handicap. If this were to be like a video game,
right,
and everyone's picking their characters and it's a fighting game, you turn the handicap up a little bit so that character gets a little bit more power when they do the same moves as you.
Yeah, a good example is like Eddie Murphy, who like back when he was 23, he recorded Delirious, and there's all these like homophobic jokes, which he's publicly condemned, but they're really brutal. And I feel like, he gets a pass because, he's a minority.
Yeah. Right. And that I think that might be fair. There may be some other factors there.
Sure.
But for the sake of this discussion, those are just the two biggest things that I feel, to the level in which, to answer the question, how much can someone actually be canceled, it really is dependent upon those two things.
Right.
If we give too much power to unpopular opinion, then we're going to be held to the voice of that unpopular opinion. And because it's unpopular, it's dangerous sometimes to give all of the power to those people. But if we do, then we're at their beck and call, right?
Right.
And the same thing with tech media companies. Right now, tech media companies can delete an image from Facebook.
Right.
They can remove your content.
Right.
They can delete your account. But you can always go to a different IP address and log in as a new person, create a new account, and then just continue.
Right.
Or use a VPN to mask your IP address and then do it over and over and over. And they can never truly stop you. So So at that level, they're not like coming into your home and arresting you and throwing you in a prison. No one's actually like stopping you from doing the
Exactly.
things. The tech media companies are just making it more and more difficult at that individual user level. Then there's another level of cancel culture in which those same tech media companies can jack up certain hyper viral videos or clips in order to paint certain pictures as one way or another.
Right.
And that is totally controlled by the interests of the social media companies and the tech companies, and who also is in their back pockets and who funds their payroll.
Right.
You know what I mean? So,
because I believe that they're doing what they think is they're either doing what they think is the right thing, or it's profit motivated.
right, there's this big discussion to segue and sort of digress a little bit from the question of whether or not certain platforms online are publishers or platforms.
Yeah.
And
230.
Right, and so if you're a platform, then the idea is you should allow free speech of all kinds.
Right. AT&T is a platform because I can call anyone on any AT&T line and we can talk about whatever.
Right. They're a platform for you to stand upon to shout your voice out.
Right.
There are publishers and publishing companies who are held to certain standards, and they will limit what can and can't be said on their platform. So there's a lot of debate out there, right? And depending on what type of social media you're using, depending on what type of actual media you're consuming, like if it's news media or Reddit or 4chan or wherever you're at, it seems as if there's a lot of influence right now from those big media companies on people because they get to show us this picture versus this picture or this video clip versus this video clip.
Right.
And it's all kind of under their control at how the algorithms work and what actually gets shown to us. And so they can cancel us, and they also can influence what is and isn't canceled, because sure, there isn't this lawful system of legislation that says we can or can't do things, but there is a growing social contract that is being signed by more and more people every day unconsciously, and it's being manipulated and influenced by these social media companies for the interests of those third parties who are lining their pockets, basically. So we have to be careful here, because there is room for extreme cancellation to the degree in which it will be made impossible for you to speak online on those platforms.
Yeah, and so like for me, it's like on one hand, like I think that, I look at my own biases, which, I try to be non-biased, but of course I have my convictions. And I think like, okay, these companies are made up of individuals who probably are bound together by similar convictions and similar biases. And so I just don't think there's any group of people out there, let alone one person, who's unbiased enough to decide what is truth and what is not, and what should propagate and what shouldn't propagate. But then also at the same time, like, there's that new movie, The Social Dilemma, where the guy who made it postulated that it's not actually that Facebook has a political agenda.
Right.
They're just getting bitched at so much by people on the left to cancel people on the right, or to censor people on the right, that they are kind of trying to play like this middle ground. We're like, oh yeah, we'll do a little bit of censoring.
Sure.
We'll indulge both sides a little bit.
But and you will get into the sort of conspiracy theory-esque level of like circular logic,
right?
Because we don't know. We're not Facebook executives, but there are agendas everywhere. There are people who have money who are influencing things.
Sure.
Even on The Social Dilemma, they were talking about it.
Yep.
And so I guess my point is to what level can we be canceled right now? As you mentioned, not terribly in the West. Again, we're not going to prison, but the potential is there, and we have to be conscious of it. And that's the biggest thing that I'm trying to drive home right now is if we're not conscious of it, we will be manipulated either on purpose or not. We will fall into sort of this herd mentality of the consensus in which what we're consuming in our day-to-day lives will affect us to the point in which we won't be able to discern what is actually being canceled and what isn't, because we're giving too much power over our lives to the tech media companies.
Right.
So that's what I meant to highlight, because tech media companies, government itself, and unpopular opinion. Those are the three factors which will determine how far cancel culture can actually unfold.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll move on.
To what degree should freedom of speech or expression actually be allowed? Is there a level in which we should not be free?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that there already exists some. You can't slander people. You can't commit fraud. You can't convince someone to give you their bank account information and steal all their money.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't use your freedom to usurp others of their freedom.
Exactly. That's a great way of saying it. And, I can see an argument for certain things. By the way, it's a lie that you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. That's not a law. You can do that. It doesn't actually really harm anybody. But I do think that there are some laws that should be enacted around freedom. I mean, I don't think you should be allowed, if you're a really compelling speaker, I don't think you should be allowed to go around convincing people to drink poisonous Kool-Aid, which is different than incite to violence, right?
Yeah. So that's a good point. So I'll talk about that. But to go back really quick, if you yell fire in a movie theater, you might get sued by the movie theater.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to go to jail for that. They're not going to cancel culture you.
Yes.
They're not going to like stop you from speaking in public by throwing you in jail.
Right.
But that is something that we didn't talk about earlier. You can get thrown in jail, which is a level of cancel culture. But I guess we did a little bit.
Yeah. I actually do have more to say about the law being a form of cancel culture later, but we'll talk about that later. Okay.
But yeah, you might get sued or punished somehow by the actual movie theater, right?
Right.
But
or just be banished, never be allowed to come back.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I like how you're bringing up there are already stipulations at what free speech actually is and what the limits are written in our actual law currently, but I think inciting to violence is something that I really wanted to talk about. So a lot of people, when they talk about free speech and you ask them to define what it is, they will say free speech to say whatever you want except for inciting violence. Right. Except for calling to action people to be violent.
Right.
That seems to be the consensus that I hear from most people. So the question is there ever a time in which violence should be allowed to be called to action through the freedom of speech? And for me, I feel like, yes, there is. And this is a really tough philosophical question of free speech and when we should or should be able to use it. Because, for instance, if that is what you really feel, then if your government becomes tyrannical, when are you allowed to yell at your friends to all get together and go perform an act of terrorism? And because you will be labeled a terrorist because it's a politically motivated coup against your government in which you're rebelling against that actual government.
Right.
So it's written in our Constitution that if the federal powers become too tyrannical, then we should all gather up our armaments, go fight them, and take back the powers.
Sometimes laws are meant to be broken.
Sure. And so it's like there is a level in which violence should be allowed to be called to action. And if there are scenarios in which violence should be able to be called to action through your freedom of speech now becomes this very gray thing where it's not so absolute, in my opinion. It's because it's all scenario based. It's like, oh, you should have freedom of speech to say whatever you want except for X, Y, and Z. But if X, Y, and Z become A, B, and C, then maybe, and if they're E, D, and F, or G and H, like things are different, and your freedom of speech and the ability to be free should change and shift like the tides of the ocean or something. And then it becomes really difficult to write laws about because there's so much gray area.
Yeah, because how are you going to maintain that free speech is always a good thing, or that the law surrounding free speech that says you can't incite violence is always a good thing when you're also saying that sometimes it can be a good thing?
Right, and it's
contextual.
Like how?
Yeah.
And are we able to actually pinpoint exactly? That's something that I haven't done myself as a personal thinking individual. I haven't actually sat down with pen and pad and been like, okay, in these scenarios, I think freedom of speech should be this, this, and this, and vice versa. Just because I know that I'm limited by my own government, right? I'm limited by my own social contract, so I haven't spent a lot of time trying to make those changes in my head. But it's a good question. And I don't think that there is a good argument for limiting freedom of speech ever, but we do because we have to in order to maintain order to some level.
That makes sense.
Right?
So it's not like it's philosophically correct, it's pragmatically correct.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think if we actually try to get to the meat and bones of that question, it's almost impossible to say at what point we should be able to, but we do for the sake of the greater good and sort of like a utilitarian approach.
Right.
To where it's like we just put the limits on it for the sake of protecting the most people, not allowing people to get robbed or swindled or conned or whatever.
Right. So I think one thing that people denigrate as far as it pertains to the laws around free speech is that it sometimes feels like they're rules for thee and not for me. Because our government goes to war with people, which means they have to talk about it first, which means they are inciting violence in some sense. And by the way, laws around free speech really only apply to people within America and other people you interact with in your own country. I would be very surprised if someone would ever be jailed because they said, I wanted to kill Osama bin Laden.
Right.
I'd be very surprised.
Well, you can even say, I want to kill the president of the United States currently. Like
Can you?
you can
we said
say that.
precedence, by the way, with a C.
Yeah, right. For the algorithm out there listening, for the AI bot.
Yeah.
Don't cancel us. I'm not trying to do that.
He's not saying that, yeah.
I'm not a terrorist. Even though my old skate crew was called
Right.
the American Terrorists.
Was it?
Yeah, it was.
Fun fact about BJ.
But yeah, we're talking a lot right now about legislation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But philosophically speaking is what I kind of want to get at when it comes to free speech. And that is, to go back a little bit, I personally feel as if, sort of like from a more libertarian or almost anarchistic point of view, all people should be able to say all things whenever they want to. If somebody wants to con you or swindle you, technically they should be allowed, in my personal opinion, because it's like, it's the freedom to do they're literally just speaking, and you were the one who fell to into their trap.
Yeah, I guess like if you could make that argument for like if I do a really good job advertising a faulty product to you and I really sell you on it and you spend $1,000 on it and it was all of your life savings, I don't think the company should be held responsible.
And they aren't usually.
Right.
And morally, it's kind of shitty and they're kind of D-bags.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that, but
it's almost as if, like, going back to the N-word thing, and society will weed out those snakes and cut its own grass.
Right.
To give a metaphor.
It's a good one.
People will become conned enough times and talk about it in the social order in which, like, people no longer will try to con you, or if they do, you will already know, and you'll be leery of that. And unfortunately, there will be some people who will have to be damaged and hurt. And so that's why we create that pragmatic sort of, you can't say X, Y, and Z because we have to protect people. But personally, I feel it's not free, right? And I really uphold freedom to be a very important factor of living as a human being.
Right.
I guess you can be held accountable for those freedoms, but I guess that's a big concept too, right? Is we can be free, we can make those decisions because we have free agency as individuals.
Right.
If I want to, I can do whatever I want, although there is consequence.
Eventually someone might stop you.
Right.
It's like Grand Theft Auto. You can do whatever you want till you have 5 stars and you're going to get caught. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I guess freedom of speech, as long as it isn't totally snuffed out by some crazy authoritarian regime, we are always free to say whatever we want.
Well, beyond that too, like you can force me to act like I respect you in a business environment, but you can't get deep into the inner workings of my mind and make me respect you.
Exactly.
So you always kind of have that autonomy.
There is some freedom always, as long as you aren't being, really jailed somehow, or really put under duress to not speak.
Should we hold people responsible for the things they say or do? Perhaps both? Are there some scenarios that warrant cancellation more than others?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like you can take any other position. Of course, people should be held responsible for their words.
Of course.
So much so that I don't really build long-term relationships with people who, always validate what I say. Like a yes man. Like a yes man, exactly.
Even when it comes to like constructive criticism, when you're saying, "Hey, I wrote this paper," or "Will you check out my book?" or whatever.
Yeah, or if I show you a couple bars that I wrote.
And they're like, "Yeah, man, that's awesome. Yeah."
Yeah, I need feedback from people. I don't like hanging around people like that. I think that to a certain degree, one of the problems though is that we denigrate people who, like, if I were to be held responsible for what I said when I was 16, that wouldn't be good for me, because I was a dumbass.
So I guess
we should reward growth when people change their opinion.
Yeah. So, but to answer the question though, which is like, are there certain scenarios which warrant? Like, I guess the question is, should we be cancel cultured more so about our actions that we perform, or our words? Is there like a level in which you feel that if you perform an action that is egregious, that you should be held more accountable for that than something you said?
I think if you truly find something egregious, it is part of your freedom that you can rally as many people as you want who also detest such things, and you can speak out against it. That's your absolute right.
So I agree with you. So yes, we should be held accountable for what we say and what we do. We should only be held accountable for what we say in very, very specific scenarios.
But we should be willing to face the consequences.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like, you should be able to say whatever you want, in my personal opinion, but there will be consequence. Where I kind of get hung up is that most of the time what I'm observing in my life with people who are participating in cancel culture are those people seem to want to cancel others based on a difference of opinion or taste or like personal flavoring.
Right.
not necessarily because what someone is saying or doing is actually immoral or amoral. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's kind of what you were saying. It's not, oh, that person over there is doing something objectively wrong.
Right.
Or they're saying something that's objectively wrong, which for one, that's a slippery slope too. But there are certain things that we would agree if you went and killed someone, that would be objectively wrong,
Right.
usually. And if you said that you right now were on your way to kill someone, then you should be probably arrested
Exactly.
for threatening them,
Right.
for calling to violence for
Right.
some whatever reason. But it's all about not canceling others simply for the difference of opinion that I run into problems with, and whether that is actions or words. And I find them to be on the same level personally. Right. But I mean, if we really, really think about it, don't we usually hold people more accountable for actions than words? Usually?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, especially if you're talking about the law.
Or anything.
Or anything,
So, like, if you promise me you're going to give me $20 next week and you don't give me the $20,
right.
I'm going to hold you accountable for the action that you didn't take. And then if you said, you know...
Or if I stole $20 from you.
Then that's even a bigger deal
right.
than if you said you would give me money and didn't.
Exactly, right.
So I think we always, as people, because we're practical animals and we're tangible, physical creatures, it's all about the action. And that's part of the reason why I think free speech is so important, because we're just speaking to each other.
Right.
It's not like I'm invading your space and taking your things from you or beating you up. I'm just saying things.
Well, that's a good question. Is there a difference between simply calling someone out because you think they have a bad opinion, or like literally wanting them to be removed from Facebook?
Exactly.
Right.
And that's kind of the question. I guess that's kind of where I think we're trying to move in this episode right now, which is exactly that. We're just speaking. We're not necessarily actually doing things. And so when it comes to cancellation forever of us on a platform, it should be more about what we're literally doing on the platform.
Right.
Like, and that's a bigger question. What can you even do on a platform that you should be held accountable for?
Right.
Because usually if it's just text on a screen, is that different than posting a meme? Is that different than stealing someone's credit card online?
Right.
You know, these are actions versus words being said.
Right.
So I feel like we always should be held more accountable for negative actions
Agreed.
over words. And that is also why I highly value freedom of speech, because again, it's just words.
I think we all universally hold people more accountable for their actions, kind of like you just said. Mm-hmm. I think that there's really only a small minority of really loud and obnoxious people who want to actually cancel people for a difference in opinion. And I think what that comes from is that, and this is almost offensive, it's almost mean, but I think it's true. I think people who have a hard time regulating their emotional responses to certain ideas or jokes or comedy want to regulate the actions of other people.
Sure. And that goes back to the earlier question that we answered earlier about small minority groups having control and being leery and aware of how much control and power you're giving to these minority groups, because that will, ensue.
Right.
Not to reiterate and totally repeat myself all over again, but another reason that I think, to segue a second, that small minority groups are doing this is not necessarily always what you just explained it to be, but sometimes is in the exchange of power and hierarchical processes and systems. And in the postmodern world, all of these minority groups are all about dismantling the patriarchy and changing the status quo and things. I feel like some of these people feel so subjugated and held down and repressed for so long that they're just pathologically bandwagoning on any process that empowers them.
Or that muscle has kind of been reinforced long enough.
Yeah, we've hit the button on them so many times.
That's true too.
To where it's just these people are acting out, and now it has evolved into this. But again, this is a completely different conversation.
Yeah, but once comedy starts to become attacked, that's where I think we've really crossed a big line.
True pathology.
I wrote a blog called "The Vital Necessity of Comedic Relief." We'll post it in the link in the description. But it seems as though people only get offended by comedy when it involves them, and that's really my issue. The jester was always above contempt; like he couldn't be persecuted.
Yeah, because he would make fun of the king.
Right.
He would say things like in the old medieval era. I mean, there were times which jesters could be killed. I mean, kings could do whatever they want to, and you kind of had to tote that line. But for the most part, they did have some degree of immunity, and they could say whatever they wanted to for the sake of comedy.
Right. So I think comedians getting I think comedy is like one last true place where freedom of speech is actually fostered, because I think we're kind of like losing our grip on it. But comedy gives
is like
me hope.
the ideal image of the freedom of speech,
Right.
to you,
Right.
and yeah. So I think we've exhausted this question, and we've brought up a couple of other concepts that we maybe should explore in other episodes.
Sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
We'll just bookmark that.
Definitely.
Perfect.
Although you establish that there is utility in holding people accountable for their actions and statements, does it warrant the permanent or complete cancellation of that person, or can there be a road to redemption?
So if there is to be a road to redemption, which I think there should be, we haven't delineated it yet. We don't know what that looks like. There's no official person you have to call when you fuck up, and they have to deem you worthy again. But if you truly love somebody, you would be thrilled that they changed their opinion over a long period of time.
You would want that.
You'd
right?
want that.
You want
And
to
so-
see people grow.
Exactly. And so, like, Tulsi Gabbard is the example I like to use because I really like her. I disagree with her on some things, but I appreciate her in her character. She gets ridiculed because she spoke out against gay marriage like 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But she has since changed her opinion. And that's another problem that I have these days, is that we don't take people's words for face value enough. I think we project things onto people when people are, for the most part, genuinely espouse what they believe. And so I do think people reserve the right to change their opinion over a long period of time. And not only do I think that should be allowed, I think it should be celebrated.
Yeah, definitely, totally celebrated, because what we're about on this channel in the archive is all about personal growth and development. And yeah, we should hold people accountable for their actions, but we do change, we do grow, right?
Right.
I did such dumb stuff when I was 17 or 18, and now I'm more of an adult, and I wouldn't even...
I will only judge you for 18-year-old BJ.
Right. I mean, that's a whole nother philosophical question about, since we keep bringing up law and order, it's like when you do certain things, you get thrown in jail and you have a record. How long until that record is expunged? And sometimes it's never expunged. And is that fair or not? Same thing with freedom of speech and cancel culture. Is it fair that people get permanently canceled forever for things that they said? Is there something so egregious that if they say it ever, it doesn't matter if they become a better person? Should they still be held accountable for that thing that they said? And I don't think so. Again, because I value freedom of speech so highly, I think that the answer is no. But we think of it sometimes as if it's an action, right? And the internet really is partly to blame for this, I think, because just like the archive, the whole concept behind why we labeled our channel the archive, the internet is an archive.
Right.
It's where if you say something, it's there forever.
Yeah. Shout out to our discourse on text debates on social media as well.
Link in the description for anybody on YouTube. But really, we should be mindful of what we're saying, because we are now held accountable. The internet does exist, and anything can be dug up at any time on you.
Yeah, it's like a permanent record.
Right. But it's just unfortunate now. It's changed the ball game, I think, in the way that our culture, the way that humanity itself sociologically has changed. Because before, your word is bond, and if you said something and somebody else said something, it was kind of about character, and you could get away with certain things. You could get away with saying certain things and doing certain things, where now it's much harder to commit crimes and get away with them with surveillance and the internet, all these things. So I think it does a good job at keeping us accountable, but I don't agree with the idea of it being a forever permanence, like just a perpetual, you said something. I don't think that there's anything ever that anyone could ever say that should warrant their permanent cancellation.
Right. There's no Voldemorts,
Right.
Like, there's no unspeakable...
Except for maybe treason against your country by releasing secrets or something that could be potentially harmful to other people. Other than that, I don't think that there's anything that I can think of quickly off the top of my head that should warrant complete cancellation. Maybe things that you say that lead to actions occurring that cause death or dismemberment or things. Maybe if you use...
I don't know about that, actually, though.
Because, we did talk about that earlier,
You know, the guy who killed John Lennon was inspired and justified to do so by his interpretation of The Catcher in the Rye.
Right.
But we shouldn't, we shouldn't jail whatever that guy's
the author.
name. Yeah.
I mean, that's why this is such a touchy subject, and why we wanted to do this for an episode of the Union of Opposites, because there is so much depth here, and there's so much utility in being free and in limiting people, and finding the balance between them is so hard.
Right.
Personally, I don't feel like there is a permanence to freedom of speech, ever needing to be canceled to a degree in which it's forever.
Right. I don't think anyone should be canceled for three things: for mean things or hateful things, for lies, or for conspiracies. Like definitely those three things. I don't think anyone should be canceled for. I don't think anyone should be necessarily be canceled if they read your work and they interpret it. They weave together some narrative by picking and choosing certain parts of your work and use it to justify a murder or something like that. But I do think that there are instances of incite to violence, and maybe we disagree on that, like to a small degree. But I think for the most part, we agree that usually incite to violence should be condemned and forbidden.
But if somebody does it, right? Is there ever a time in which they should be forgiven and let back onto a platform? So
yeah, which is the question.
Yeah,
right?
like on Facebook or YouTube, you incite violence, you get canceled for, say, you get banned for 10 days from Facebook, and you come back, you do it again, they ban you for 6 months, you come back, you do it one more time, they perma-ban your account. Or if you're a famous person and you say something that incites violence, and then the whole world hates you, and you can't get a gig anymore, and you can't get a job, and you have to basically quit your livelihood forever, and 10 years down the road you try to do the same work, and then the label you're signed to or whatever, whoever that publishing company is, they say, nope, sorry, 10 years ago this happened, that's bad press, we can't accept you, like you're gonna have to keep being a janitor or doing whatever. Like, should it be that way? Because that's the way it seems to be now.
Well, it's also, and another field where that's becoming prevalent, except maybe like in a different way, is entertainment. Hollywood won't endorse or support your book or your movie if it doesn't have diversity. Now you have to have diversity. You can't write a story about a family on the peninsula of Ireland right now because it's not
inclusive,
right? And I know people in the writing industry who can attest to that.
Yeah, and it's kind of the same thing there, right? It's just, I don't know, it's a really tough question, and I don't know if we'll ever get to the succinct, clear-cut answer on it. It's always going to be up to the flavors of the people who are watching and listening, and everyone's going to have difference of opinion on this. And again, that's kind of the motivation for why we're doing this. In these episodes with Union of Opposites, it's truly concepts that are polarized, that we'll never truly be able to make sense out of one way or the other without making a firm, willful decision to just take a side, or to make a firm, willful decision to try and integrate and transcend. So with that, I think that will lead us to our final question.
How can we incorporate both concepts into our lives in a nuanced and balanced way?
So I think a lot of these mimetic phrases aren't branded very well. I don't think the word cancel culture is of great utility. I think a better way to look at it is we should live in a judgment culture. Not only where we judge ourselves, but where we use our free speech, we say what it is we need to say, and we pay attention to the responses, because we're built that way psychologically and biologically. We have facial expressions and we have nonverbal cues that can show someone how you feel about what they say, and if you pay attention to the responses you get, you'll be better as a person.
And you judge immediately what's happening in that conversation, face to face,
in real time.
Yeah, so that I agree with that. So when it comes how I think we can unify these that is, in my opinion, what free speech actually is. Free speech is that tool that we use in order to discern what's good and what's not, and that's a judgment call, right? We're making value judgments, and we're being as open as possible with everything. So I guess in this union, I'm leaning more towards free speech still, but I'm pragmatically taking the concept of canceling other people and the underlying value that you gain out of canceling others, which is being extremely critical in order that you can find the truth or define the truth. Because by canceling them, you are defining what is true, and that's the real value behind it. If we look at this like a painted picture,
right,
we strip it of all the color, but we still have the framework of the image. The framework, which is the value, is going to be defining truth and righteousness, basically. Right. And so take that energy, take that value, and incorporate it with allowing people to speak freely in discerning and judging what is true. So although I'm leaning one way, I'm using the cancel culture's value structure to critically analyze everything that is around me, which comes to me through the allowance of the free speech.
Right. So kind of what you're saying is that only focus on how you can practice these things at your own individual level and don't project it onto other people, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case.
It kind of reminds me of something, a little story that I have. When I was a kid, I remember me and my dad were playing video games, and the machine like spat out a bunch of quarters. And my dad and I at first, like, we were like, hell yeah, like let's play more video games. But then my dad quickly was like, oh, this is a good moment.
Yeah.
He basically told me that you're judged the most when no one's looking. And I think he was referring to God. But even if you don't believe in God, you can kind of look at yourself as the judger of yourself, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I think that has pragmatic utility, to act like you're being judged or to judge yourself harshly sometimes.
Right. And so that is a concept that we reiterate a lot on the channel. Is it doesn't matter whether or not something is objectively true. It's just whether or not it has actual utility that we should incorporate it into our lives often. And I like that. So in incorporating the two things, we don't necessarily want cancel culture to exist in reality to the level that we've talked about today. Mm-hmm. But we want to take the values that underpin that whole process mm-hmm. and apply them pragmatically with freedom of speech as the outlet, right? And so if we treat ourselves in how we speak about things freely as if we might be canceled for saying certain things,
exactly,
we might better... We shouldn't treat it as such to the level in which I'm afraid to be canceled, so I'm not going to say what I will say. But we should treat it that way to the level in which I will be more clear with my speech.
Exactly.
Like, I will say what I mean. I will be impeccable with my word. Shout outs to the 4 Agreements book review that we did. Link will be in the description for anybody on YouTube. It's just unifying them allows me to better uphold my personal values in a way that is more conducive to the whole, right? Because if I'm acting as if personally I will be held accountable for these things, whether or not I will or will not be, it will lead me to a place of speaking more clearly, saying what I mean, not being hyperbolic with my words, not being overly emotional, because I want to convey clearness through my freedom of speech. And it's just a good balance.
It's like just knowing that there are external forces that will judge you should kind of naturally make you a little bit more self-aware and introspective as to what you put out there.
Right. But you don't treat it, you're not unifying it to such a degree in which, again, you're worried that you will be canceled, so you don't speak. You should still speak your truth freely. You're using that system, that potential cancellation, as a pragmatic tool to pretend that it will happen, regardless of whether or not it will, in order to check yourself and balance yourself so that way you're not just spewing bullshit or becoming a troll on the internet, or you're not just fighting for the sake of fighting. You're using your words responsibly, and you're only speaking to truly try to make some change in the world, or to truly get to the heart of whatever the matter is. And that is the best way, in my opinion, to unify the two concepts.
A brief recap of integral philosophy.
Integral philosophy states that there exists some truth in all positions. We understand that opposition literally shapes, balances, and defines our own values and ideas. In the case that one is unable to integrate with opposition or come to a perfect middle ground in which they recognize any value therein, we strongly encourage them to live and let live, because again, we can only evolve by means of inclusion and integration. We cannot hope to transcend through destruction alone. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it. You can find us on all major social media and streaming platforms. But if you would like to find a list of all of the links, please visit the description within the YouTube video.
And if you do like our content and want to support our work monetarily, you can visit us at patreon.com/thearchiveowl. But more so than anything, we just encourage you to like, subscribe, and share so we can beat the algorithms.
And with that, we'd like to thank you for joining us and continuing the great conversation.